better?
Yeah.
Does that work? Okay. So thank you all for having me. Thank you for all the service that you provide to our community. As Joe mentioned, I am the Interim Associate Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement at the College of Law. My background, though, is tax and business law. So I was a practicing lawyer for 10 years doing corporate and partnership tax planning, also worked a couple of years with the IRS. And so some of you probably were like, oh, I hope she was talking about tax, right? Normally it's as opposed to DEI. Normally when I offer up, right, what I did for a living or that my discipline is in tax, it's usually like the conversation killer in the cocktail parties. So it's that, or right, my other hat now at the College of Law is also in this diversity role. So I think before I get started, what I'll say is, so DEI, right, is this policies and actions that are intended, I think proponents would say, are intended to bring in folks into workplaces, into colleges and universities, folks that have different perspectives and viewpoints, different life experiences, and also to provide people who historically have been underrepresented in those spaces an opportunity to thrive. Opponents, I think, might say it is, DEI and these policies are basically unmerited advantage, right? And even would go so far to say perhaps it is a form of reverse discrimination. And so I will say for me, DEI is something that is personal. So I'm the first and still only person in my family that went to college. My father was drafted to the US Army to fight in Vietnam. At the time he went, he was working in the plantation fields in Hawaii. He's from Lahaina originally in Maui. And so at that time he was living with his mother and 3 siblings. His father died when he was 6. And so he did that and made that a career, and he is proud to have done that. My mother actually immigrated to the US from Germany when she was a young adult, and she went to El Paso, Texas, of all places, where there's a huge military contingent there, if anybody's been there. I feel like everyone I talk to has been through El Paso, but never stays, right? It is a beautiful place on the border of Juarez, Mexico. But my mom went there. There's a German Air Force contingent on Fort Bliss. And so she went there to be a secretary and met my father. And so I was born and raised in El Paso. So that's my story. So I'm going to talk about DEI, anti-DEI legislation in Tennessee. And it's really, think of it as, I think it's primarily 2 areas. So one is education, K through 12 and higher education. And the other place that we see a lot of activity is with respect to anti-LGBT initiatives. So before I go there, though, I'll tell you there's one bill that's kind of an outlier that just got enacted March of this year. And it's a police reform bill. And so it basically prohibits local governments from passing any ordinance or enacting any policy that would impede local law enforcement from engaging in minor traffic stops. And so the popular press says that this is a rebuke to the city of Memphis and its city council in the wake of the death of, if you remember, Tyree Nichols was killed. A 29-year-old Black man was killed in Memphis while he was in police custody after a traffic stop. And so Memphis City Council passes a law that says no more of that, no more stopping citizens for minor infractions, right? For a broken headlight, not using your blinker, because their perspective was you're using that, and this is not uncommon, to use that as a pretext, right, to investigate some other crime that this person may know something about or be involved in. And that's a very common police tactic. It's constitutional. But Memphis didn't want its police force doing that anymore. So the General Assembly responded by telling local governments, that's not within your purview, right? You will not do that. So we're not going to do anything to impede law enforcement in that way. So there's that bill. And so then I'll turn to education. So I think it was, 2021, the General Assembly passed a law known as the Divisive Concepts Law. And it applied to K through 12 instruction. And it basically said, educators, teachers, you cannot educate or instruct students with respect to certain divisive concepts, as that term is defined in the statute. And I'll just give you a sense of what some of these concepts are. So you cannot teach that one race or sex is superior to another race or sex. You cannot teach that a person, because of their race or sex, is inherently privileged or racist or sexist. You cannot teach that a person's moral character is determined by their race or sex. And similar, right, that's just a flavor of it, but there's like 10 or 12 divisive concepts that K through 12 teachers could not teach or instruct about in the classroom. And then a year later, we got a divisive concepts law that applies to higher education. And so it's narrower, right? Because in higher ed, we have right, academic freedom, right? That it's a different dynamic. And so instead of merely instructing or teaching, the law there says, with respect to higher ed, that colleges and universities cannot require students or employees to endorse any particular ideology or political viewpoint, and nor can they be penalized for failing to endorse any of the listed divisive concepts, which are similar, right, to the law that it was enacted with respect to K through 12. And then we got some amendments last year and this year to that law in higher ed that kind of frames out a process for reporting. Like if you want to complain about a teacher or try to indoctrinate you in some way that violates the law, you report that, it gets reported up to the state. And then there are some timeframes now on sort of what the response, 5 days, the university has to initiate an investigation, and within 30 days, the investigation has to be concluded. And so, as I was preparing for this talk, I thought, I don't know what the impact of these divisive concept laws are. One, they're fairly new. But in the law school, we have not had students complaining, right? I think that the impetus was the fear that, right, colleges and universities, professors like Joe and I, right, are seen as very liberal, and that somehow we are forcing students to adopt something, a belief and ideology that is not theirs, or that we will punish them for not, right, adopting that viewpoint. But we've not had any complaints. And it actually started in law schools, right, where they were saying, oh, you all just talk about systemic racism and, these kinds of hot button topics. Students have not been complaining. But then I was talking with Joe, and he's actually, as he mentioned to you, had this issue come up a couple of times. And so I don't know if it'd be appropriate at this point. I just want you to add some flavor to that, if you would. Tell us about your experience.
So I can share 2 examples because I was investigated twice on 2 reports last semester that have both become unfounded. So part of what we teach, obviously in communication and especially in public relations, we teach about everyone having a voice in the marketplace of ideas. I have a lot of friends that think very differently on topics than I do. We still get along, we still have to work together. So that's what we teach in the classroom. So in the Intro to Research Methods course, one of the lectures I give is we created what we call the worst survey. We need to teach students how to craft good survey questions to get the data we need. We all use it in our industries. So we created 10 questions, another faculty member and I, that there's something wrong with each question on why you wouldn't do it. One of the questions on there was a healthcare related question about women's reproductive health. Okay, and the question is meant to make you uncomfortable in the question, because you never want to create survey questions where you're making your participant uncomfortable, especially when you're talking about protected classes, things like that. And that's what we talk about when we teach it in the classroom. I had one student report me to the dean because the discussion in the classroom made her uncomfortable. And it wasn't about the question, it wasn't about women's reproduction, that's not my expertise area. It was how would we better craft this question to make our participants feel less uncomfortable. So I was reported, had to go through investigation. We've since changed the survey, okay? And now the question is about pooping. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share the worst survey with you. So the question is about, so we'll see, that lecture was on Monday, so we'll see if I get reported this semester. The other example is I had a student last semester who was not doing well in class, had received some bad grades, and I always give extensive feedback. And she decided to scroll through 10 years of my posts on Instagram to find some meme that I posted 10 years ago that she disagreed with and reported me to the dean. That one guy, that took some effort because I post a lot. The dean investigated, they showed me the meme. How it got thrown out, as I actually pointed out, they never looked at the date that that was posted. And it was, I've only been at UT for 3 years. So that was 7 years before I came to UT, but the dean dismissed it because the student literally, it was borderline stalking to go back that far on like someone's social media to find one thing that was completely unrelated to anything in the classroom, but disagreed with what I had posted on my personal social media channel and reported me. So that also got investigated. These were both in the same last semester at the university under the Divisive Concepts Law. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's just, I know when the law first came out, faculty across the campus were worried. You know, even if you're like, I don't in tax, right? I mean, maybe some topics touch on these things, but I'm not telling my tax students, you know, Hawaiian German people are superior to every other person. Like, how does that come up, right? But that was the fear, I think, that the legislature thinks that we are, I don't know what they think. But the chilling effect that the law has, like I've had some, we have an excellent constitutional law professor who stopped teaching Kwon law, right? Because they do talk about things like abortion and a lot of police interactions. And she's like, yeah, I don't need that. Who needs that, right? And so people are changing hypotheticals that they teach in the classroom because we don't want to trigger somebody to cause an investigation to happen. And so that's unfortunate, right? The university experience should be a place where it is a free sort of market of ideas, right? And that's how we grow and develop. So there's that. I don't think we have much time left. I'm going to blow through some of this. There was you've probably heard Florida and Texas, I think, are the ones that are mostly in the news. They have banned DEI offices and activities on campuses, public colleges and universities. We had a bill that was filed here or in Nashville, and it went to the Higher Education Committee, subcommittee, and it would have also, right, gutted all DEI in public colleges and universities. The Knoxville Jewish Alliance sent a letter to the legislators telling them that the bill could have adverse impacts that would prevent the University of Tennessee from supporting Jewish students. And they read that letter into the record, and that was sufficient for them to kill the bill. Nobody voted for that bill, including the sponsor. And so I don't know the whole story about, did the Knoxville Jewish Federation do that on their own, or were they approached by the university? You know, but I have heard some people say, if the NAACP would have sent a letter, would it have mattered, right? But because of the Jewish Federation doing it, that was enough to stop that bill. So another year of having DEI on campus, and we'll see, right? I'm sure we'll have another opportunity to have that law potentially enacted next year. The other, trying to get used to the, like, I can see, but I can't see at that age now, right? Like, oh, what am I doing? Yeah, we have just a few minutes. So let me turn to some of the anti-LGBT legislation. So, right, if you follow the news at all, this state has got a lot of anti-LGBT legislation. We are the first or near the first when you talk about some of these laws, so we're sort of leading the charge. So it started in 2016, where counselors and therapists, they can refuse to take on a patient if that person's beliefs or behaviors are inconsistent with the counselor or therapist's personal beliefs. So that started in 2016. Then we got a trans bathroom bill. That was in the news. That was also a few years later, 2021, where basically if public restrooms allowed a trans person, so let's say it's a man who born a man but transitioned to a woman, and the public restroom allowed that person to use a woman's restroom, a restroom marked for women, then they had to post a sign outside the bathroom stating that, basically. And that law never went into effect. As you might remember, the day before it was supposed to go into effect, right? It got challenged immediately in the courts, and a federal court found it unconstitutional. Transgender athletes, we were the third state to adopt a rule about transgender athletes in middle and high schools. They have to compete on the teams of their assigned sex at birth rather than their gender identity. There is, let's see, the drag ban, that was 2023. We were the first state to criminalize female and male impersonators who perform in public or in front of minors. And so that law also was declared unconstitutional about a couple months after it was enacted. In 2023, we also got no gender affirming health care for minors. And so, let me see, let me skip through. There's some litigation pending. It's actually now, I think the plaintiffs won in the lower court. It was appealed to the Sixth Circuit and reversed. So the plaintiffs have now asked the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, to review that case, and it's pending there. So that's another thread that you see, right? Like we enact, or our elected officials enact all these laws, and they're often challenged immediately. And then we go through the legal process, and many of them are ruled to be unconstitutional. And there have been a couple laws that have been filed, passed this year. One is, so just a statistic. So this year there were 34 bills filed dealing with LGBT issues. And of those 34, 2 of them have become law. And so one of them deals with, there are certain people authorized in the law to solemnize, to perform marriages, rabbis, priests, your pastor, certain government officials like judges and politicians. And it says, you're authorized to perform a marriage, but you're not required to. And the law, when it was first filed, basically said you're not required to if doing so would violate your religious or personal beliefs. They took that out, and now it just says, right, you're not required to. And so people have speculated, like, is it aimed at same-sex marriages, right? If that violates your religious convictions, then you don't have to perform that marriage. Could it also apply, right, to would have applied to my parents, for example, right? I'm a biracial kid, right? A European mom and a Native Hawaiian Korean father, right? So the law is vague in that respect, but that law passed. So there's a definite trend with respect to anti-LGBT. I'll stop here. I don't know if we have any time left.
Yeah, there's a couple.
Do
Couple
I?
questions.
Yeah, if there's questions about any of that, sort of where it came from, sure.
When these laws are struck down, I assume they're struck down by federal courts. What basis do the courts give for striking down these laws? And do you think the legislature is aware these laws are going to be struck down when they pass them and do it anyway?
Yeah, no, I do think there is a signaling function for sure, right? You can appease your constituents by at least, you know, sponsoring these bills and getting them and voting for them and getting them enacted, even if you might know that they won't ultimately be held up. That the press enjoys, right, all the folly that goes on. And I have to believe that they know. So many of the bills that have been, or the laws that have been struck down are based on the US constitutional grounds of due process, equal protection, that sort of thing. And so, you know, at some point I would think you would learn a lesson. And I'm also sure if you're not a lawyer, they have legal counsel, legislative counsel. So I think my personal view is it's intentional. You know, it sends a message, even if we know ultimately it's not going to stick. Other questions? Sure.
In this country, we're blessed to have a right, freedom of speech. We have the right, but maybe it's sometimes not always right. Now, when does it cross the legal line of being illegal? It's freedom of speech, but when does it become illegal?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't know if there are any First Amendment lawyers in here. So there is a line for sure, right? It's not, none of these rights that we have are absolute. We all probably have heard about the one, like you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, right? You can't hate speech, right? There are some limitations to what you can say, but where that line is, I'm not sure. And so even right with this divisive concepts law, there are concerns like, is the legislature violating my First Amendment right and my academic freedom to control and deal with, right, my students in my classroom? I'm not aware that I think it's been challenged at the K through 12 level, but yeah, that's a hard question. Where are the limits? What are the lines? Yeah.
I know the University of Tennessee is becoming more and more diverse in many ways. One of those being geographic representation from many different states and many different countries. And I'm sure that there's a lot of students who are coming from other areas that may not be quite as conservative as Tennessee, or may not have these type of laws or things that are trying to be enacted. How does that, you know, those conversations, how are those taking place in the classroom or, you know, during kind of, from your perspective as an instructor?
Yeah, so those conversations definitely happen. You know, we want to have a robust conversation. We just ask people to, you know, it's civil, right? I almost had 2 students get in a fist fight in contract law of all places because we were talking about a case where a judge, a woman had signed a contract, right? When she signed it, it's like, well, you're legally bound to that. And the courts excused the contract because she was uneducated, didn't understand what she was signing, right? Basically said, this is unconscionable that this rent-to-own furniture store took advantage of this woman. And so these 2 students, and interestingly, their positions, if you thought about stereotypes, were reversed. So the white student comes from a poor family, single mom, 7 children. The Black student came from a family of 2 lawyers in some fancy part of Atlanta, but they like got into it in there. So we have those conversations. Yeah, I do think it's a problem. I don't know so much about student recruitment, but for faculty recruitment, we have had trouble recruiting faculty because the legislature, like we're in the national press every time, like the bathroom bill, and oh, we did this, and oh, we did that. And so potential faculty hear about that and they're like, I don't think I can live there. Like, what's it like, right? So we try to show them like this is a warm and welcoming community and our university is supportive and Knoxvillians are wonderful. But it's hard to work against, right, that look. Yeah.
So I just want, before I ask a question, I want to clarify your question. I belong to the Arab American Public Council, and every time we have any kind of event and we advertise, we get a lot of hate mail, hate messages. So we try to let people, like the law enforcement, know, because we don't want the actual event to be destroyed by somebody who knows about it. And most of the time, when we go to them and say, this is what this person said, this is what this person said, they say, unless it's threatening, it's not unconstitutional, this is free speech. So they can cuss us out all they want and tell us that we're all terrorists, we're all whatever, it's okay. But unless they say I'm gonna come and kill you, that's free speech. And that's I think is the area. What my question to you is that when we talk about this inclusive law, it sounds to me from everything that you are talking about, it's becoming more division and not inclusiveness. How do you come to where you make these division, these differences become like one big happy family instead of like you're white, you're black, you're Latino, you're whatever? How do you come up with that, with these laws?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, I think there is some thought to, right, that calling out our differences is making it worse, but then there's another, right, camp that says, by asking me to assimilate and just says, we're all human, we're all God's children, that is also, I'm having to negate, right? It's one thing if you're all from Europe, right, European ancestors, and you share all the same sort of background, but what about people who don't share that background, right? You're asking me to assimilate in a way that requires me perhaps to give that up. But I don't know, I hear you, right? Is it better to just have a say, we are all part of the human race, right? We are all God's children, and get on with it. But the legislature's not doing it either, right? And our country is so polarized. You know, I don't know what we do about that. Do you have an answer to that? Do you have a solution?
Actually, I do.
Okay.
Rotary is the most inclusive organization in the whole world. What we need to do is make it a requirement that anybody who runs for public office be a Rotarian.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, I like it. Thank you. Oh, I think, are we out? Yeah.
Thank you.